On the night of October 13th, 1973, 15 farmhands were locked inside a barn in Clay County, Tennessee, and burned alive. All men, all killed in under 3 hours. The perpetrators? 2 brothers who owned the land, Daniel and Robert Morrison, landowners, third-generation farmers, members of the First Baptist Church of Salina. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation would later call it the most brutal rural massacre in state history. But the reason behind the slaughter wasn't a drug deal gone wrong, wasn't organized crime, wasn't even a labor dispute. It was 5,200 pounds of missing tobacco and an $8,500 debt that the Morrison brothers believed their workers had stolen. 15 men died for less than $600 each. And the tobacco? It was never stolen at all. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Clay County, Tennessee, stretched across 237 square miles of rolling hills and Cumberland River bottomland in the fall of 1973. Population barely touched 7,000 souls scattered across timber country and tobacco farms. Salina, the county seat, sat at the junction of the Obie and Cumberland Rivers, with a main street that featured 1 stoplight, 2 churches, a hardware store, and Mackey's General Store where locals gathered for coffee and gossip. The entire town could fit inside 3 blocks. You could walk from one end to the other in under 10 minutes. October in Clay County meant temperatures cooling to a comfortable 62 degrees during the day, dropping to the low 40s at night. The air smelled like cured tobacco hanging in darkened barns, wood smoke from evening fires, and the damp earth smell that came off the Cumberland when fog rolled in at dawn. Mornings arrived with the sound of roosters crowing from farms hidden in the hollows, and evenings brought the distant barking of coon dogs and the low rumble of pickup trucks on gravel roads leading nowhere in particular. But 1973 was a hard year for tobacco farmers. The federal quota system that had protected small growers for decades was showing cracks. Prices fluctuated wildly. Big corporate operations in North Carolina and Kentucky were squeezing out family farms. In Clay County, tobacco wasn't just a crop. It was currency, identity, and survival all rolled into one. A man's tobacco crop determined whether his kids got new shoes for school or wore their older siblings' hand-me-downs for another year. It determined whether he paid his property taxes or fell behind. It determined his standing in the community. When someone stole your tobacco, they weren't just taking product. They were taking your dignity, your future, your family's security. In rural Tennessee, that kind of theft was unforgivable. And forgiveness wasn't something the Morrison brothers had ever been good at. Daniel Lee Morrison, everyone called him Danny to his face, though many called him worse behind his back, was 38 years old that October. He stood 5'11" with a barrel chest and thick forearms roped with muscle from 40 years of farm work. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth from squinting into sun and scowling at problems. A jagged scar ran across his right knuckles where a tobacco knife had slipped back in '61. He walked with the aggressive forward lean of a man always heading somewhere with purpose, whether he actually had purpose or not. Every morning, Danny woke at 5 a.m. sharp, made instant Folgers coffee, 3 heaping spoons and a chipped mug that said, "World's Best Dad," a Father's Day gift from 1968. He'd stand on his front porch in coveralls and boots, smoking Pall Mall cigarettes and surveying his 420 acres like a general inspecting his domain. Check the tobacco barns, count the cattle, make mental notes of everything that needed fixing, which was always more than he had time or money to fix. He'd married Sarah Jane Crowder in 1956, right after he got back from 2 years in the Army. She was 37 now, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a bun, who'd spent 17 years married to a man who measured love in acres, owned rather than words spoken. They had 3 children. Daniel Jr., age 16, who'd already started showing his father's mean streak. Amy, 14, quiet and afraid of her daddy's temper. And little Robert, 10, who still believed his father could do no wrong. What Danny valued most was respect, not affection. He didn't particularly care if people liked him. But respect, that was different. Respect meant people knew you were serious, knew you kept your word, knew you didn't tolerate being crossed. His grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1890. His father had expanded it during the Depression when weaker men lost everything. Danny had inherited 420 acres of prime tobacco land, and he'd be damned if he'd lose it to thieves, banks, or bad luck. Except by October 1973, he was losing it anyway. The mortgage sat at $42,000. He was 3 months behind on payments. The bank in Salina had started sending letters with phrases like default and foreclosure proceedings that made his hands shake with rage when he read them alone in his truck. Robert James Morrison, Bobby to family, Bob to everyone else, was 35 years old, 3 years younger than Danny and always 3 steps behind in every way that mattered. He stood 6 feet even, but somehow always looked smaller than his brother, shoulders hunched forward like he was perpetually bracing for a blow. His face was softer than Danny's, still held some boyishness around the eyes, but his hands were just as scarred and calloused. A birthmark shaped vaguely like Tennessee covered the left side of his neck, something he'd been self-conscious about since childhood. Bobby had never married, lived in a trailer on the back 40 acres of the family property, drank Pabst Blue Ribbon every night until he fell asleep in his recliner with the television playing whatever came through the antenna. He tried to make his own way once, moved to Nashville in '65, got a job at a Firestone plant. Lasted 14 months before loneliness and his brother's constant phone calls about family responsibility pulled him back to Clay County. By '73, he was essentially Danny's shadow. Worked the same land, took the same orders, held the same resentments, even if he didn't have the same fire behind them. What Bobby valued most was peace. Not achievement, not respect, just peace. But peace required avoiding confrontation with his brother, and avoiding confrontation with Danny meant going along with whatever Danny decided. So Bobby went along. He always had. And in October 1973, going along would mean crossing a line he'd never be able to uncross. The 15 men who worked the Morrison tobacco harvest that fall weren't criminals or drifters. They were local men, Clay County born and raised, plus 3 seasonal workers from neighboring Jackson County. Marcus Lee Washington, 42, Vietnam veteran with a Purple Heart and nightmares he never talked about. His wife Loretta worked as a housekeeper at the Salina Motor Lodge. 4 kids, ages 18 down to 9. James Edward Patterson, everyone called him Jimmy, 28 years old, dreamed of opening his own auto repair shop. Married 6 years to Betty Sue, 3 little girls who called him Daddy Jim and waited on the porch every evening for him to come home. Billy Ray Crowder, 19, married exactly 3 months to Melissa, who was already 2 months pregnant with their first child. This was Billy's first full harvest season. He'd told his young wife he'd save every penny so they could maybe rent a place in town, get away from living in her parents' spare room. These weren't strangers to the Morrison brothers. Danny had known Marcus Washington since grade school, back when Clay County schools were still segregated, and the black kids went to the colored school 3 miles outside Salina. Jimmy Patterson had fixed the Morrison farm truck twice that summer, charging fair prices and doing good work. Billy Ray Crowder was actually Danny's second cousin on the Crowder side. Family in the complicated way that everyone in Clay County was family to everyone else, if you traced back far enough. For 6 weeks, these men had worked sunrise to sunset in the Morrison tobacco fields, cut the plants, hung them in the curing barns, tended the fires that dried the leaves to that perfect golden brown that buyers wanted. Hard work, brutal work, the kind that left your back screaming and your hands blistered raw. But honest work, paid work, and in Clay County in 1973, you didn't turn down paid work. That was the arrangement. Work the harvest, get paid when the tobacco sold. That was how it had always been done. Danny sold his tobacco crop at auction in Clarksville on September 21st. Brought in $18,300 for the full harvest. Good money, maybe the best money he'd made in 3 years. Enough to catch up on the mortgage, pay the workers their wages, maybe have a little left over. On September 22nd, Danny came home, put the cash in his gun safe, and told Sarah they might actually make it through the year. For one night, she saw him smile. The trouble started on September 24th, A Monday morning. Danny went to check on the cured tobacco stored in the secondary barn, the old timber structure they used for long-term storage. He pushed open the door, stood there counting bundles, counted again, counted a third time because the number couldn't be right. 5,200 pounds of cured tobacco were missing, gone, vanished like it had never existed. Wholesale value, $8,500. More importantly, that was the premium tobacco, the top-grade leaves that would have paid for the entire next planting season. Danny stood in that empty barn, rage building in his chest like steam pressure in a boiler. He didn't call the sheriff, didn't call his insurance company. He called Bobby. And together, the two brothers reached the only conclusion that made sense to them. The workers had stolen it. Had to be. Nobody else had access. Nobody else knew where the good tobacco was stored. Those men he'd trusted, worked alongside, paid fair wages. They'd robbed him blind. The brothers spent the next 2 weeks asking around, casually, carefully. Any of the harvest boys seemed to have extra money? Anybody buying new trucks, taking trips? The answers came back clean. Nobody was flashing cash. Nobody was acting suspicious. But Danny didn't care about evidence. He cared about certainty. And he was certain. On October 10th, a Wednesday, Danny drove into Salina and stopped at Mackey's Hardware on Main Street. Bought 60 feet of heavy-duty chain, 2 padlocks, told Jack Mackey he was reinforcing his equipment shed against theft. Jack nodded, made small talk about the weather turning cold, wrapped the chains in brown paper. That evening, Danny and Bobby sat on the front porch. Danny drank black coffee. Bobby drank Pabst Blue Ribbon straight from the can. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Danny said, "We're going to handle this ourselves." Bobby looked at his brother, at the hard set of his jaw, at the way his scarred knuckles gripped that coffee mug like he was trying to crush it. "Danny, maybe we should..." "We should what? Call the sheriff? Clayton Boone? That man couldn't find his own ass with both hands and a map. Call the bank and tell them the money I owe them got stolen by the same men I paid to work my land? No. We handle this like men. Like our daddy would have handled it. You with me or not?" Bobby took a long drink of beer. Tasted like metal and regret. But he said what he always said when Danny backed him into a corner. "I'm with you." Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway, holding a dish towel, listening to her husband plan something she didn't want to understand. She opened her mouth to speak, to say anything that might stop this. But Danny's eyes met hers, and whatever she saw there made her close her mouth and go back inside. On October 12th, Friday evening, Danny made phone calls. 15 calls to 15 men. Same message for each. "Need everyone at the farm tomorrow night, 7:30. Got final payment ready and need to settle accounts before winter. Don't be late." His voice was calm, friendly even. The voice of a man about to pay his debts and close out the season. Marcus Washington hung up the phone and told his wife Loretta, "Morrison's finally paying up tomorrow night." Thank God. Jimmy Patterson told Betty Sue they could maybe buy that washing machine she'd been wanting. Billy Ray Crowder told Melissa they'd have money for the baby coming in spring. None of them knew. None of them suspected. Why would they? Danny Morrison was a hard man, a cold man, but he'd always been honest about wages. When he said he'd pay you, he paid you. Saturday, October 13th, 1973, was a beautiful day in Clay County. Temperature hit 64 degrees under clear blue skies. Perfect autumn weather. The kind of day that made you grateful to be alive in Tennessee, in the country, where the air was clean and the world still made sense. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 58 degrees. Bobby Morrison stood in the barn, looking at the chains and padlocks laid out on the workbench. His hands were shaking. He wanted another beer, but knew he needed to be sober for whatever was coming. Danny Morrison loaded his Winchester rifle, checked the chamber, set it by the barn door where he could reach it quickly. In his mind, this was justice. This was restoring order. This was making sure that men who stole from him understood there were consequences. At 7:15 p.m., the first truck turned off the main road onto the Morrison property. Marcus Washington's old Ford, rust spots on the hood, one headlight dimmer than the other. Behind him came Jimmy Patterson's Chevy, then Billy Ray's Dodge that was actually his father-in-law's truck. By 7:35, all 15 men had arrived. They stood in the barn, laughing, talking, making plans for what they'd do with their pay. The barn smelled like old hay and motor oil, and the sweet bitter scent of cured tobacco from the main storage area. A single 100-watt bulb hung from the ceiling beam, throwing harsh shadows across weathered wood walls. Danny Morrison walked in at 7:40, Bobby behind him, hands shoved deep in his pockets. The conversation died. 15 men turned to face the boss, ready to get paid and go home to their families. Danny looked at them, at Marcus, who'd fought in Vietnam while Danny had stayed home with a farm deferment, at Jimmy, who had 3 daughters and a mortgage, at Billy Ray, barely more than a kid, his whole life ahead of him. "Any of you want to tell me where my tobacco is?" Danny's voice was flat, cold as the barrel of the rifle he wasn't holding yet, but everyone knew was close by. The confusion on their faces was genuine. Marcus stepped forward, always the leader. "What tobacco, Danny? We loaded everything you told us to load. 5,200 pounds missing, $8,500 worth. And I know one of you took it." The barn erupted. Denials, protests, confusion. Jimmy saying, "We didn't take nothing, Danny. I swear to God." Billy Ray looking like he might cry. Marcus trying to calm everyone down, trying to reason with a man who was beyond reason. What happened next would later be described by prosecutors as premeditated murder with exceptional cruelty. Bobby Morrison moved to the barn doors, pulled them closed. The heavy sliding doors that were original to the structure, solid oak, built to last. He threaded the chain through the handles, locked the padlock, the clicking sound of that lock echoing in the sudden silence. 15 men realized simultaneously that they were trapped, that this wasn't about payment, that whatever was about to happen, they wouldn't be going home tonight. What Danny Morrison didn't know, what he would never know, because he would kill himself in a prison cell 5 years later rather than face the truth, was that the missing tobacco had never been stolen. On September 23rd, Clarksville Tobacco Logistics had sent a truck to pick up a storage order for Harlan County Warehouse in Kentucky. The driver, new to the route, misread his paperwork, picked up the wrong barn's worth of tobacco from the wrong farm, realized his mistake 3 days later, stored the tobacco in a company warehouse in Clarksville while trying to figure out how to explain the error to his supervisor, never made the call, never returned it. Just let it sit there while 15 men worked and waited for payment and walked unknowing toward their deaths. A clerical error, a confused driver, a supervisor too busy to follow up. That's what killed 15 men. Not crime, not betrayal. Just the kind of mundane bureaucratic mistake that happens 1,000 times a day across America without anyone dying because of it. But in Clay County, Tennessee, on the night of October 13th, 1973, that mistake was about to be paid for in blood and fire and screams that would echo across those dark hills for hours, heard by no one, saved by no one, witnessed only by 2 brothers who believed they were serving justice when they were really just serving death. The week before the massacre, life in Clay County moved at the slow, predictable rhythm it had followed for generations. On Sunday, October 7th, Sarah Morrison woke at 6:30 a.m. to make breakfast for her family. The kitchen smelled like bacon grease and percolating coffee, Folgers in the blue can because that's what they'd always bought. Sunlight came through the window over the sink, catching dust motes in the air and warming the yellow linoleum floor that Sarah had mopped the night before. Danny sat at the head of the table reading the Sunday Salina Herald, the weekly paper that covered local news nobody outside Clay County cared about. Harvest reports, church announcements, the high school football team's latest loss. Danny Jr. shoveled eggs into his mouth without looking up from his comic book. Amy picked at her food, watching her mother move around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of 17 years in the same house. Little Robert was under the table making engine sounds with his toy tractor, a green John Deere that Santa had brought last Christmas. "Church at 10, Sarah said, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "Don't want to be late." Danny grunted acknowledgement. "He'd go because that's what you did in Clay County. Showed up at First Baptist every Sunday. Sat in the same pew your family had occupied since 1892. Sang the same hymns. Heard the same sermons about sin and redemption that never seemed to stick to anyone. After church, they'd drive to the Sonic Drive-In in Livingston, 23 miles away. Same ritual every Sunday for 5 years now. The kids would get hamburgers and cherry limeades. Sarah would order the chicken sandwich. Danny would get the double cheeseburger and onion rings and complain the whole time that it cost too much for what you got. "Daddy," Amy said quietly, "can I get a vanilla shake instead of a Coke?" Danny looked up from his paper. His daughter's face was hopeful, cautious. She knew better than to ask for extras when money was tight. "Sure, baby girl. You can get whatever you want." Amy smiled, a rare thing in that house, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. She looked at her husband, at the way the morning light showed every line in his weathered face, and thought, he's trying. Despite everything, he's trying. She didn't know that in 6 days, Danny would become something she wouldn't recognize. That the man who just promised his daughter a vanilla shake would lock 15 men in a barn and burn them alive. That was Sunday. On Monday, everything began to change. Monday morning, Danny drove to Cookeville, 37 miles south on Highway 52. Far enough from Salina that nobody would recognize him. Close enough to get there and back before lunch. He stopped at Putnam Hardware on Spring Street, a place he'd never been before, where the clerk was a stranger who wouldn't remember his face. "Help you?" the clerk asked. He was maybe 60, with thick glasses and a name tag that said Harold. "Need some chain?" Danny said. "Heavy duty, and a couple padlocks." Harold nodded toward the back of the store. "How much chain?" 60 feet, 3/4-inch links. They walked to the hardware section. The chain hung on a wall display, priced at 79 cents per foot. Harold pulled it down, measured out 60 feet, cut it with bolt cutters that made a sharp metallic crack with each cut. "These padlocks work?" Danny pointed to a display of master lock padlocks, the kind that could withstand bolt cutters, the kind meant for serious security. "Best we got, $22 each." Danny bought 2. The total came to $91 to $40. He paid with 5 $20 bills, crisp and new from the tobacco money. Got his change. Harold wrapped the chain in brown paper, put the padlocks in a small bag. "Building something secure?" Harold asked, making conversation. "Tool shed," Danny lied. "Been having theft problems." "Shame," Harold said. "Can't trust anybody these days." Danny carried his purchases to his truck, a 1968 Ford F-100, forest green, rust spreading from the wheel wells like cancer. He set the chain and locks on the passenger seat, covered them with a canvas tarp. His hands were steady, no shaking, no doubt. In his mind, this was preparation, not premeditation. This was self-defense, not murder. This was what a man did when the law wouldn't help and neighbors wouldn't respect, and thieves thought they could steal what he'd spent his life building. Tuesday afternoon, Danny and Bobby sat on Danny's front porch. Temperature had dropped to 55 degrees, and the wind had shifted to come from the north, carrying the smell of coming winter. Bobby drank Pabst from a can, his 4th of the afternoon. Danny smoked Pall Malls and stared out at his tobacco barns in the distance. "You sure about this?" Bobby asked. His voice was quiet, uncertain. "Sure about what?" "You know what." Danny turned to look at his younger brother. Bobby's face was flushed from beer and worry, his birthmark dark against pale skin. "They stole from us, Bobby. $8,500. Might as well have reached into our pockets and taken our wallets. What am I supposed to do? Let them get away with it? Could call the sheriff. Clayton Boone couldn't find his ass with both hands and a road map. You know that. Could let it go. Write it off. Insurance might. No." Danny's voice went cold and flat. "No insurance. No letting it go. We handle this ourselves. Like men. Like Daddy would have." Bobby took another drink of beer. Remembered their father, William Morrison, dead of a heart attack in 1968, who'd been a hard man, a violent man when he drank, who'd taught his sons that weakness was worse than wickedness. "What exactly are we handling?" Bobby asked. Danny smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Saturday night. I'm calling all 15 of them to come get their final payment. When they're all in the barn, we're going to have a conversation. Find out who took our tobacco. Get it back. Make sure they understand there are consequences. And if they don't confess, they will. Bobby wanted to ask more. Wanted to know exactly what consequences meant. But he was afraid of the answer, so he finished his beer and said nothing. At that exact moment, 23 miles away in the small community of Moss, Marcus Washington was teaching his youngest son how to change the oil in their 1965 Ford Fairlane. The car was up on jack stands in the gravel driveway. 9-year-old Anthony lay on his back underneath, wrench in hand, Marcus guiding him through each step. Turn it counterclockwise, Marcus said. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Remember? I remember, Dad. The drain plug came loose. Black oil poured into the catchpan, thick and warm. Anthony scrambled out from under the car, grinning, his face smudged with grease. Did it. Good job, son. Now we wait for it to drain, then we put in the new oil. They sat on the porch steps, drinking sweet tea that Loretta had made that morning. The October afternoon was perfect. Cool enough to be comfortable, warm enough that you didn't need a jacket. Leaves on the oak tree in the yard were starting to turn orange and red. Dad, Anthony asked, when I grow up, can I work on cars like you? Marcus had worked on tractors and farm equipment for 15 years before taking the seasonal work at Morrison's farm. Good with his hands, patient with machinery. The kind of man who could fix anything if you gave him enough time and the right tools. You can be whatever you want, Anthony. Mechanic, doctor, teacher. Sky's the limit. But you work on farms. For now, but I'm saving up. Maybe next year I'll have enough to rent a shop in Salina, do repair work full-time, be my own boss. Anthony's eyes went wide. Really? Really. Morrison's paying us this weekend. That'll be enough to get started. Marcus looked at his son, at the hope and excitement on his young face, and felt something tighten in his chest. Love mixed with determination. He'd survived Vietnam, 12 months in hell that still visited him in nightmares. He'd survived coming home to a country that didn't want him, to a Tennessee that still had whites-only signs in some windows, even after the Civil Rights Act. He'd survived all of that to build something for his kids, to give them chances he'd never had. Saturday night, I'm picking up the money, Marcus said. Then Sunday, we're driving to Knoxville. I'm taking your mother shopping for a new dress, something fancy. And we're eating at a real restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins. Anthony laughed. Mom's gonna cry. Probably. But good tears. They sat there in the October sunshine, father and son, completely unaware that Marcus Washington had 4 days left to live. Wednesday night, Danny couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathe, watching the digital clock on the nightstand tick from 11:47 to 11:48 to 11:49, red numbers glowing in the darkness. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant voices. He thought about what he was planning, saw it play out in his mind. The workers arriving, the accusations, the locked doors, the confessions he'd force from them. And then what? He couldn't let them go. Couldn't let them walk away knowing what he'd done, ready to call the sheriff, ready to testify. Danny's stomach twisted. He got out of bed carefully, not waking Sarah, and walked to the bathroom. Stared at himself in the mirror above the sink. 48 years old, weathered face, hard eyes. Was this who he was? Was this who he'd become? He could stop, could call the whole thing off, call each man tomorrow, say never mind, come by next week. Something came up, pay them their wages. Let the missing tobacco go. File an insurance claim. Take the loss. Move on. But then he thought about the bank letters, about foreclosure, about his grandfather's land bought with blood and sweat and sacrifice, slipping away, about being the Morrison who lost everything, about his sons knowing their father was weak, couldn't protect what was his, about those 15 men, some of them laughing at him right now, spending his tobacco money, thinking they'd gotten away with it. No. Danny's jaw tightened. He turned off the bathroom light and went back to bed. Tomorrow he'd make the calls. Saturday they'd all come. And he'd get his answers one way or another. There was no turning back now. Thursday morning, while Danny Morrison was buying 5 gallons of kerosene at the Salina Feed and Farm for cleaning equipment, he told the clerk, Jimmy Patterson was at home, kissing his 3 daughters goodbye before heading out to his day job at the Marathon station on Main Street. "Bye, Daddy," they chorused. Emma 6, Grace 4, little Julie, barely 2, still learning to talk. Betty Sue stood in the doorway, pregnant with their 4th child. Due in January. Another girl, the doctor had said. "Love you," Jimmy called out, climbing into his Chevy truck. "Love you too. Be safe." Jimmy drove the 2 miles into Salina thinking about the money Morrison would pay Saturday. $1,600, his share of the harvest wages, enough to catch up on the electric bill. Enough to buy Betty Sue that washing machine she needed, so she wasn't spending hours every week bent over the sink, scrubbing clothes by hand. Enough to put something in savings for when the new baby came. He'd worked hard for that money. 63 days straight, sunrise to sunset, cutting tobacco in heat that made your clothes stick to your skin, hanging the heavy stalks in barns that felt like ovens. His hands were scarred from the tobacco knives. His back ached every morning. But it was honest work, hard work, the kind of work that meant something. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Friday evening, October 12th, Danny Morrison sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, made a list of all 15 names. Next to each name, he wrote a phone number. Some he had to look up in the phone book, the slim Clay County directory that listed maybe 800 households total. Sarah watched him from the kitchen counter, where she was washing dishes. She'd been quiet all week, sensing something wrong but afraid to ask. "Danny," she said finally, "what are you doing?" "Calling the workers, telling them to come get paid." "Why Saturday night? Why not during the day?" "Because I said so." His tone left no room for questions. Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel, walked past him without another word, and went upstairs. A few minutes later, he heard their bedroom door close. Lock. Danny picked up the phone. Rotary dial, mustard yellow, mounted on the wall. He dialed the first number, listened to it ring 3 times before someone picked up. "Marcus, it's Danny Morrison. Need you to come by the farm Saturday night, 7:30. Got your money ready and we need to settle accounts before winter." He made that call 15 times. Same script, same calm, friendly voice. Several of the men thanked him. Said they appreciated the work. Said they'd be there. By 8:30 p.m., all 15 calls were done. Danny hung up the phone for the last time and stood there, his hand still on the receiver. His heart was pounding. His mouth was dry. It was done. They'd all be there Saturday. All of them in the barn at the same time. No witnesses, no one else around. Bobby arrived at 9 p.m., found Danny on the porch, smoking, staring out at nothing. "I made the calls," Danny said. "All of them coming?" "All of them." Bobby sat down, opened a beer. His hands were shaking. "Danny, I've been thinking." "Don't think. Just be there. 7 p.m. Bring your rifle." "My rifle? Danny, what?" "Just in case. For intimidation. They need to know we're serious." Bobby drank his beer and didn't ask any more questions. But he knew. Deep down, in the part of his soul he tried to ignore, he knew this was going to end badly. Knew they'd crossed a line that good men don't cross. But he was in too deep now. Had always been in too deep, following his brother's lead since they were kids. At 10:15 p.m., Danny walked upstairs. Sarah's bedroom door was still locked. He stood outside it, hand raised to knock, wanting to explain, wanting to apologize in advance for what was coming. But he couldn't find the words. "Sarah," he said through the door, "I love you. I need you to know that. Whatever happens, I love you." No answer. But he heard her breathing on the other side. Knew she was awake, knew she was crying. Danny went to Amy's room. She was asleep, her face peaceful in the dim glow of her nightlight, a plastic owl that Sarah had bought at the dime store. Danny kissed his daughter's forehead. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he whispered. "But some things a man can't let go." He checked on the boys, Daniel Jr. and little Robert, both asleep. His sons, his legacy. They'd understand someday, when they were older, when they had their own land to protect. Danny walked downstairs one last time, put on his jacket, picked up his truck keys. Bobby was waiting in the driveway, engine running, headlights cutting through the October darkness. They drove to the barn, unlocked it, checked everything. The chains were there, coiled on the workbench, the padlocks, the kerosene cans, 5 gallons total, hidden behind a stack of hay bales. Danny's Winchester leaning against the wall. "Tomorrow," Danny said. 7:30. "Tomorrow?" Bobby echoed. At that exact moment, in 15 different homes scattered across Clay County, 15 men were going to sleep. Some of them dreaming about what they'd do with their wages. Some of them making plans with their wives. Some of them just grateful for honest work in hard times. None of them knew. None of them suspected. How could they? Saturday, October 13th dawned clear and cold. Temperature at sunrise was 47 degrees. By noon it had climbed to 64 degrees. Perfect autumn weather. The kind of day when Clay County looked like something from a postcard. Hills covered in oak and maple trees showing their fall colors. The Cumberland River running slow and silver under blue skies. Marcus Washington spent the afternoon finishing the oil change on the Fairlane. Jimmy Patterson played with his daughters in the backyard, pushing them on the tire swing he'd hung from the big oak tree last spring. Billy Ray Crowder drove to Salina with his young wife Melissa to buy baby supplies, holding her hand in the truck, talking about names. If it was a boy, maybe Marcus after his friend. If it was a girl, maybe Sarah after his grandmother. At 6:45 p.m. the sun set. Temperature dropped quickly to 58 degrees. Clear night. No clouds, stars beginning to show in the darkening sky. At 7 p.m., Danny and Bobby Morrison stood in their barn. Danny checked his Winchester, made sure it was loaded. Bobby held his own rifle, a Remington 700 he'd bought used in 1969, and tried not to think about what they were about to do. "Remember," Danny said, "we're just going to scare them, make them confess. Nobody has to get hurt if they cooperate." Bobby nodded. Wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe his brother wasn't planning what Bobby feared he was planning. At 7:15 p.m., the first truck turned onto the Morrison property. Marcus Washington's old Ford, one headlight dimmer than the other, rust spots on the hood. Behind him came Jimmy Patterson, then Billy Ray. Then the others, arriving one by one, parking in a line outside the barn. By 7:35 p.m., all 15 men were inside, standing in a loose group near the center of the barn, laughing, talking, making plans for their Saturday nights. Most of them would go straight home, kiss their wives, count their money. A few might stop at Duffy's Tavern in Salina for a beer and some pool. At 7:40 p.m., Danny Morrison walked into the barn. The talking stopped. 15 faces turned toward him, expectant, waiting. And in that moment, while those 15 men stood in Danny Morrison's barn believing they were about to get paid and go home, while their wives and children waited for them, while the October night settled cold and clear over Clay County, the last chance to stop this, the last possible moment when tragedy could be avoided, slipped away like smoke. At 7:40 p.m. on October 13th, 1973, 2 brothers locked 15 men inside a barn and set in motion a horror that would scar Clay County forever. 7:40 p.m., Saturday, October 13th, 1973. Temperature outside had dropped to 58 degrees. Inside the Morrison barn, with 15 men packed together and one 100-watt bulb throwing harsh shadows, it felt warmer. The air smelled like old hay, motor oil, and the sweet bitter scent of cured tobacco from the storage area. October wind moved through gaps in the weathered boards with a sound like whispered warnings nobody was hearing. Danny Morrison stood near the barn doors, Winchester at his side. Bobby positioned himself near the workbench. Remington held loosely, trying to look casual. 15 faces turned toward them, expectant, waiting. Most were smiling. They'd worked hard, done honest work. Now they'd get paid and go home to their families. Danny's mouth was dry. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought everyone must hear it. This was the moment, the point of no return. He could still stop, could pay them, shake their hands, send them home, could call the whole thing off. Then he thought about the missing tobacco, about $8,500 gone, about losing everything his grandfather built, about being weak. "Any of you want to tell me where my tobacco is?" The words came out flat, cold. Not a question, an accusation. Confusion rippled through the group. Marcus Washington stepped forward, Vietnam instincts making him the natural leader. "What tobacco, Danny? We loaded everything you told us to load. 5,200 pounds missing, $8,500 worth, and I know one of you took it." The barn erupted, voices overlapping, denials, protests. Jimmy Patterson saying, "We didn't take nothing, I swear." Billy Ray Crowder looking like someone had slapped him. Thomas Henderson, 41, with 4 kids saying, "Danny, come on, we've been working your land for 6 weeks. Why would we steal from you?" Danny's face stayed hard. Bobby. The doors. Bobby hesitated. 1 second. 2. Long enough for Marcus to notice, to turn, to see what was happening. Then Bobby moved to the big sliding doors, pulled them closed with a hollow boom that cut through all conversation, threaded the heavy chain through the door handles. The chain made a metallic rattling sound that echoed in sudden silence. Click, the first padlock. Click, the second. 15 men realized simultaneously that they were trapped. "Danny." Marcus's voice stayed calm, but his hands had moved to his sides, body language from Vietnam, preparing for a fight. "What are you doing?" "Getting answers. Nobody leaves until I know who stole my tobacco." "We didn't steal anything." "One of you did. Maybe all of you. Doesn't matter. We're going to sort this out right now." Jimmy Patterson stepped forward, hands raised, palms out. "Danny, please. I got 3 little girls at home. Betty Sue's pregnant with our 4th. I need to get back." "You should have thought about that before you robbed me." "We didn't rob you." The shouting started again. 15 voices, all talking over each other, fear beginning to replace confusion. Bobby stood by the doors, rifle in his hands, face pale. His birthmark stood out dark against white skin. 7:52 p.m. Marcus moved toward the doors. "Danny, this is crazy. You can't just lock us in here." The Winchester came up fast, pointed at Marcus's chest. "Stay back." Marcus stopped, looked at the rifle, looked at Danny's eyes, saw something there that made his blood run cold. This wasn't about tobacco. This was about something broken inside Danny Morrison, something that had finally cracked all the way through. "Danny," Marcus said quietly, "I know times are hard. I know you're struggling. But this ain't the way. Let us go. We'll help you look for your tobacco. We'll help you figure out what happened. But you gotta let us go." No. That one word. Final. Absolute. Carlos Mendez, 27, seasonal worker from Texas, started toward the back of the barn, looking for another way out. Any way out. His wife Maria was home in San Antonio with their 2-year-old daughter, waiting for him to come back with money for her mother's medical bills. Danny swung the Winchester toward him. "Stop." Carlos stopped, raised his hands. "Por favor, señor. I have family. Everybody's got family. Didn't stop you from stealing. I didn't steal nothing. I come here to work, make honest money." "Shut up." The barn had gone quiet except for heavy breathing, and someone, Billy Ray probably, the youngest one, crying softly. Outside, the October night was peaceful. Inside, 15 men were beginning to understand they might not see their families again. 8:03 p.m. Thomas Henderson tried reasoning. "Danny, even if someone did take your tobacco, and I'm telling you nobody here did, you can't just hold us hostage. The Sheriff's not coming. Nobody knows you're here. Far as anyone knows, you came to get paid and left. Could be hours before anyone misses you. Could be days. Our families will look for us. By then, I'll have my answers." Marcus exchanged a glance with Jimmy. A silent communication. They were thinking the same thing. If Morrison wasn't planning to let them go anyway, they had nothing to lose by fighting, 15 against 2. Even with rifles, they had a chance. Danny saw the look, saw the calculation happening. Don't, he said. Bobby's got the doors covered. I've got you covered. Anyone moves wrong, people start dying. You want that? You'd really shoot us? Jimmy asked. Over tobacco? Over respect. Over being treated like a man instead of dirt. 8:11 p.m. Bobby spoke for the first time, voice cracking. Danny, maybe we should… Shut up, Bobby. Outside, at that exact moment, Loretta Washington was setting the table for a late dinner. Marcus had said he'd be home by 8:30. She'd made his favorite, pork chops and mashed potatoes. The kitchen smelled like home cooking, and the radio played Marvin Gaye. She hummed along, thinking about the money Marcus would bring home, about maybe finally buying that washing machine she'd been wanting for 3 years. Their youngest son, Anthony, sat at the table doing homework, occasionally looking at the clock, waiting for his daddy. Inside the barn, Marcus Washington had 4 minutes left before he'd never see his family again. 8:15 p.m. Danny reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper. I got all your names here. I'm gonna call them one by one. You're gonna tell me what you know, who took my tobacco, where it is. And if I think you're lying, there's gonna be consequences. What kind of consequences? Thomas asked, though his face said he already knew. Danny didn't answer. He unfolded the paper, read the first name. Marcus Washington. Marcus stepped forward. I didn't take your tobacco, Danny. On my life, on my kids' lives, I didn't take nothing from you. Tell me where it is. I don't know where it is because I didn't take it. Wrong answer. Danny's finger moved to the trigger. Marcus saw it, saw death coming and did the only thing he could, lunged forward, trying to close the distance. Vietnam training taking over. Always better to die fighting than die begging. He got 3 steps. The Winchester cracked once, sharp and final in the enclosed space. Marcus stumbled, fell forward, hit the barn floor hard, lay still. The sound of that shot echoed and echoed and echoed, louder than seemed possible, ringing in everyone's ears like the end of the world. Someone screamed, Billy Ray maybe, or Carlos. The 15 men who'd been standing together scattered, pressing against the barn walls, trying to get as far from Danny Morrison as possible. Bobby dropped his rifle, backed against the wall. Danny, Jesus Christ, Danny, you killed him. He lunged at me. Self-defense. That ain't self-defense, that's murder. Pick up your rifle, Bobby. This ain't over. 8:17 p.m. Jimmy Patterson looked at Marcus's body, at the blood spreading across the dirt floor, at Danny Morrison holding the smoking rifle, and Jimmy understood with absolute clarity that they were all going to die here, every single one of them. You're insane, Jimmy said. His voice shook but held. You're gonna burn in hell for this. Maybe. But I'll die knowing I didn't let anyone disrespect me. Thomas Henderson, older, trying to be the voice of reason even now, said, Danny, you killed Marcus. It's done. Let the rest of us go. We won't say nothing. You'll say everything. Soon as you're out those doors, you'll run straight to Sheriff Boone. I'll be in handcuffs before sunrise. Then turn yourself in. You can say it was an accident that Marcus came at you. No, I'm finishing this. Danny reached into his other pocket, pulled out a pack of Pall Malls, lit one with shaking hands, took a drag. The cigarette smoke rose into the harsh light of the single bulb. Bobby, Danny said, get the kerosene. Bobby didn't move. What? The kerosene, behind the hay bales. Get it. Danny, no. Get the kerosene. Bobby walked like a man in a nightmare, found the 5-gallon cans hidden where Danny had stashed them, carried them to the center of the barn, set them down. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold them. The 15 men, 14 now, with Marcus dead, watched, understanding dawning, horror replacing fear. You're gonna burn us? Billy Ray's voice cracked. Danny, please, I'm 19 years old. Melissa's pregnant. We're having a baby. Should have thought about that before you stole from me. We didn't steal from you. But Danny wasn't listening anymore. Something in him had broken completely. The part that had been human, that had felt empathy or mercy or doubt, that part was gone. What remained was rage and wounded pride and a terrible certainty that this was justice. 8:25 p.m. Carlos Mendez fell to his knees, prayed in Spanish. Dios te salve Maria, llena eres de gracia. Jimmy Patterson stood frozen, thinking about his 3 daughters, about Betty Sue, about the baby coming in January. Thomas Henderson tried one more time, voice hoarse from shouting, "Danny, in God's name!" Danny started opening the kerosene cans. The smell hit immediately, sharp and chemical, overpowering the hay and tobacco scent. He began pouring it along the barn walls, methodically, completely. 5 gallons spread across old, dry wood that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. Someone, Robert Lee Johnson, 32, with a wife and disabled son at home, tried to rush Bobby. Got 5 feet before Bobby swung the Remington up. "Don't. Please don't." Robert stopped, backed away, crying now. 8:33 p.m. At the Salina First Baptist Church, 3 miles away, the youth group was finishing their Saturday night Bible study. 17 teenagers laughing, eating pizza, talking about tomorrow's service. Pastor Franklin led them in a closing prayer. "Lord, watch over this community. Keep us safe through the night. Guide us toward righteousness. Amen." "Amen," the teenagers echoed. None of them knew that 3 miles away, 14 men were about to be burned alive. 8:37 p.m. Danny finished with the kerosene. 5 gallons poured. Every wall soaked. The fumes made everyone's eyes water, made it hard to breathe. "Last chance," Danny said. "Anyone wants to confess? Tell me where the tobacco is. I'll let you walk out of here." Silence. Then Jimmy spoke. "There's nothing to confess, Danny. Nobody here stole from you. Whatever happened to your tobacco, we didn't do it." Danny stared at him, at all of them, looking for guilt, for fear that meant they were hiding something. Saw nothing but terror and confusion and the dawning realization that they were going to die for something they didn't do. For just a moment, 1 heartbeat, maybe 2, doubt flickered in Danny's eyes. What if they were telling the truth? What if he'd gotten this wrong? Then the doubt passed. Had to pass. Because if they were telling the truth, that meant he'd just locked 14 innocent men in a barn, meant he'd shot Marcus Washington in cold blood, meant he was a monster, and Danny Morrison couldn't be a monster. Monsters were other people, criminals, evil men, not 3rd-generation Tennessee farmers who went to church on Sundays. "Bobby, give me your lighter." Bobby reached into his pocket, hands shaking so bad he dropped it twice, finally got it out. A cheap Bic lighter, yellow plastic. He'd bought it at Mackey's Hardware for 39 cents 3 weeks ago. "Danny," Bobby whispered, "don't do this, please. They got families. So do I, and I'm not losing mine because of them." Danny took the lighter, walked to the barn door, the farthest point from the men, where the kerosene had soaked deepest into the dry wood. 8:39 p.m. Billy Ray Crowder fell to his knees. "I love you, Melissa. I'm sorry." Tell the baby I would have been a good daddy." Thomas Henderson pulled out a photograph from his wallet. His 4 kids, kissed it, put it back. "Lord, forgive him. Forgive all of us." Jimmy Patterson thought about his daughters, about Emma, Grace, and little Julie, about how Betty Sue would have to raise them alone, about how they'd grow up without a father because a man had lost his mind over missing tobacco. Carlos Mendez kept praying in Spanish. Robert Lee Johnson was screaming for his disabled son. Others were crying, begging, pounding on the walls even though they knew the wood was too thick, the chain too strong. Danny flicked the lighter. Once. Twice. The flame caught on the 3rd try. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said. And in that moment, he almost meant it. He touched the flame to the kerosene-soaked wood. The fire caught instantly, spread faster than he'd expected, racing up the wall like something alive and hungry. Orange and yellow and terrible. Heat washed over the barn immediately. Smoke began to pour from gaps in the boards. 8:40 p.m. Danny and Bobby backed away from the doors, stood in the yard, watching. Inside, the screaming started, voices raised in terror, in pain, in desperate prayer, pounding on the walls, bodies slamming against the chained doors. Bobby turned away, vomited behind the tractor. Danny stood frozen, watching what he'd done, watching the barn burn, listening to the screams. The screams that would echo in his head every day for the rest of his life. 8:52 p.m. The screaming had mostly stopped, replaced by the roar of fire consuming old wood. The barn was an inferno now, flames shooting through the roof, smoke visible for miles in the clear October night. Danny and Bobby stood in the yard, faces lit by firelight. Neither spoke. What was there to say? At 9:03 p.m., the barn roof collapsed inward with a crash that sounded like thunder. Sparks shot into the night sky like dying stars. The walls were still standing, but wouldn't be for long. At 9:15 p.m., while the Morrison barn burned, Loretta Washington called the Clay County Sheriff's Office. Her husband had gone to get paid at 7:15 p.m. Should have been home by 8:30. It was past 9 now. Something was wrong. Betty Sue Patterson called 5 minutes later. Jimmy always called if he was going to be late. Always. Melissa Crowder called at 9:22, crying, saying Billy Ray had promised to be home by 9:02. They were supposed to go to her parents' house for dinner. At 9:30 p.m., Sheriff Clayton Boone got in his patrol car and started driving toward the Morrison farm. He'd gotten 14 calls in the last 20 minutes. 14 families worried about 14 missing men. All last seen going to Morrison's place. 9 miles away, Danny Morrison watched his barn burn. Watched it collapse completely, walls falling inward, taking with them any evidence of what had really happened. Taking 14 bodies that would be burned beyond recognition. "What do we do now?" Bobby asked. His voice was hoarse from smoke and horror. Danny didn't answer for a long time. Then, "We clean up. Make it look like an accident. Say they were all here, we paid them, they left. Then the barn caught fire somehow. Lightning strike, maybe. In clear weather, electrical short. Old wiring. Something. Danny, 14 men are dead. You think people are going to believe that's an accident?" "They will if we stick to the story." But Danny's voice held no conviction. He knew the truth. Knew that within hours, maybe minutes, the sheriff would arrive. Would see the chains, the padlocks. Would smell the kerosene. Would know. 10:07 p.m. Sheriff Boone's headlights appeared on the main road, turned onto the Morrison property. Danny and Bobby watched him approach. Neither ran. Neither tried to hide. Where would they go? Boone got out of his car, saw the burning barn, saw the two brothers standing there covered in soot and smoke, saw something in their eyes that made his hand move to his service revolver. "Danny," Boone said carefully, "where are the men who came here tonight?" Danny looked at the fire, at what was left of the barn, at the graves he'd built for 14 families. "They're gone, Clayton, all of them gone." Boone followed Danny's gaze. Saw the chains lying in the dirt, the padlocks still locked, brass gleaming in the firelight. And he understood. "Jesus Christ, Danny, what did you do?" Danny said nothing. There was nothing left to say. At 10:15 p.m., Sheriff Clayton Boone placed Daniel Lee Morrison and Robert James Morrison under arrest for murder. 14 counts. Bobby went quietly, hands behind his back, crying. Danny walked to the patrol car, like a man already dead. The barn burned through the night. By dawn, when the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrived, when the volunteer fire department finally extinguished the last flames, nothing remained but twisted metal, charred wood, and the smell of death that would linger over that property for years. 14 men had gone to get paid for honest work. 14 men had trusted their employer. 14 men had walked into that barn thinking about their families, their dreams, their futures. None of them walked out. And Danny Morrison, standing in that jail cell watching the sunrise through bars, finally allowed himself to think the thought he'd been avoiding all night. What if they were telling the truth? What if the tobacco was never stolen? What if I killed 14 innocent men? That question would haunt him for exactly 5 more years, until April 3rd, 1978, when he'd tie his bedsheet into a rope, loop it around the cell bars, and step off his bunk for the last time. But on October 14th, 1973, at sunrise, Danny Morrison was still alive, still breathing, which was 14 more breaths than the men in his barn would ever take. The blood had been shed. The debt, imaginary, based on nothing, built from paranoia and pride, had been paid in full. And Clay County, Tennessee, would never be the same. 6 hours after the last scream faded into smoke and October darkness, Clay County woke to a normal Sunday morning. Churches prepared for services. Families made breakfast. The Cumberland River flowed slow and peaceful under pale dawn light. At 6:20 a.m., the temperature was 43 degrees, cold enough that you could see your breath, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that promises a beautiful autumn day. At 6:22 a.m., Reverend James Butler of the Salina First Baptist Church drove past the Morrison farm on his way to early service preparation. Saw smoke still rising from the barn area. Thick, dark smoke that didn't look right. Saw Danny Morrison's truck parked in the yard, but no sign of activity. Butler slowed, considered stopping, decided against it. Farmers burned things all the time, clearing brush, disposing of debris. Not his business. He'd remember that decision for the rest of his life. Remember driving past while 14 families waited for men who would never come home. At 6:47 a.m., Loretta Washington called the Clay County Sheriff's Office again. She'd been calling every 30 minutes since 9:15 p.m. Saturday. Each time, Deputy Earl Thompson had told her the same thing. "Ma'am, I'm sure he's fine. Probably stopped for a beer with the boys. You know how men are." But Loretta knew her husband. Marcus didn't stop for beers. Marcus came home. Always. Even when he was late, he called. And she'd been sitting by that phone for 9 hours, watching it, willing it to ring. "Something's wrong," she told Thompson. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "Something's wrong and you need to do something." "Ma'am, it hasn't even been 12 hours. 14 wives have called you. 14. Are you telling me all 14 men decided to just disappear?" Thompson paused, put down his coffee. She was right. 14 calls from 14 different families about 14 different men, all last seen heading to the same place. That wasn't coincidence. "I'll send someone out to check the Morrison farm," he said. At 7:15 a.m., Deputy Thompson and Sheriff Clayton Boone pulled onto the Morrison property. The barn was still smoking, a collapsed pile of charred timber and twisted metal. The smell hit them before they even got out of the patrol car. Not just wood smoke. Something else. Something that made Thompson's stomach clench. "Clayton," Thompson said quietly. "That smell, I know." They walked toward the ruins, found the chains first. 60 feet of heavy-duty chain, still locked with padlocks, lying in the dirt about 15 feet from where the barn doors had been. The brass padlocks gleamed in the morning sun, untouched by fire. Boone picked up the chain, looked at the locks, looked at the collapsed barn. His face went white. "Earl, call the TBI, right now." "What is it?" "Those chains were on the outside of the barn. Someone locked those doors from the outside while people were inside." Thompson understood, turned away, vomited into the Morrisons' yard. At 7:45 a.m., while Sheriff Boone stood guard over the crime scene with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, 3 miles away at the New Central Diner on Main Street in Salina, Martha Henderson was serving the Sunday breakfast crowd. Pancakes and bacon, eggs and grits, coffee in white ceramic mugs. The jukebox played Loretta Lynn. Children colored on placemats while parents read the Salina Herald and talked about nothing important. Martha had worked that diner for 16 years. Knew every regular by name, knew their orders before they sat down. Her feet hurt from standing on linoleum floors since 5 a.m., but she smiled anyway because that's what you did. You smiled. You served. You made small talk about the weather. She had no idea that her nephew Thomas Henderson was dead. That she'd never see him at the counter again, ordering his usual, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. That everything she understood about her safe, predictable world was about to shatter. By 8:30 a.m., the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had arrived from Nashville. Special Agent Victor Rawlings, 47 years old, 22 years with the Bureau. He'd worked homicides, arsons, organized crime. Thought he'd seen everything. He stood at the edge of the collapsed barn, looking at what remained. The fire department had arrived at 8:00 a.m., started hosing down the ruins. Steam rose as water hit still hot debris, and underneath, beginning to emerge as the ash and charred wood were cleared away, were the bodies, or what was left of them. "How many?" Rawlings asked Boone. "Don't know yet. Maybe 15, based on the phone calls from families. 15 men came here last night to collect their wages. Seasonal workers. Danny Morrison called them all Saturday afternoon, told them to come get paid." Rawlings looked at the chains, at the padlocks, at the barn. He locked them in, burned them alive. Looks that way. Jesus Christ. Rawlings had investigated dozens of homicides, gang shootings, domestic murders. But this was different. This was calculated, methodical. This was a man who'd planned every detail. By 10 a.m., they'd recovered enough remains to confirm 14 bodies, impossible to identify by sight. The fire had been too hot, burned too long. They'd need dental records, need time. At 10:15 a.m., Agent Rawlings and Sheriff Boone drove to the first family's house, Marcus Washington's home in Moss. Loretta answered the door, hope lighting her face when she saw the sheriff's car. "Did you find him? Is Marcus—" Boone took off his hat. That simple gesture told her everything. Her knees buckled. She grabbed the door frame to stay upright. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. There was a fire at the Morrison farm. We found 14 men who didn't make it out." Loretta's scream brought neighbors running, brought her children running. 9-year-old Anthony, who'd spent yesterday afternoon changing oil with his father, who'd made plans to open a repair shop someday, stood in the doorway and watched his mother collapse and knew, even at 9 years old, that his world had just ended. They visited 14 families that morning. Each time the same scene. Disbelief giving way to horror, giving way to grief so profound it seemed to physically break people. Betty Sue Patterson fainted when they told her about Jimmy. Melissa Crowder, 19 years old and 2 months pregnant, stared at them for a full minute before she started screaming that they were lying, that Billy Ray had promised to be home, that he wouldn't leave her. At each house, children watched their parents break, watched strong men cry, watched women collapse under the weight of news that couldn't be real but was. By noon, Selena knew. The phone lines were jammed, people gathered in the streets. The new Central Diner emptied as word spread. Martha Henderson serving her last cup of coffee before learning that her nephew was dead, before her hands started shaking so bad she'd never serve coffee again. At 12:30 p.m., Agent Rawlings sat in Sheriff Boone's office reviewing the files, looking for connections, looking for motive. "The missing tobacco," Boone said. Danny had been saying for 3 weeks that someone stole his tobacco, 5,000 pounds, worth about $8,000. Did they? Don't know. No evidence of theft. No evidence of anything except Danny Morrison's word. Rawlings leaned back in his chair. So he believed his workers stole from him, called them all to the farm, locked them in the barn, burned them alive, over tobacco that might not have even been stolen. That's what it looks like. Where's Morrison now? Home. Bobby too. His brother. Haven't arrested them yet. Wanted TBI here first. Rawlings stood. "Let's go get them." At 2:15 p.m., 8 officers approached the Morrison farm in 4 vehicles. They wore body armor, carried rifles, expected resistance. Expected maybe a standoff, maybe another death. What they found was Daniel Morrison sitting on his front porch, smoking a Pall Mall cigarette. No weapons visible. Bobby Morrison stood behind him, hands in his pockets. Both men watched the vehicles approach with the calm of people who'd been expecting this. "Danny," Sheriff Boone said, getting out of his vehicle slowly. "We need to talk about last night." "I expect you do." "Where are the 15 men who came here Saturday?" Danny took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "There was an accident, Clayton. A terrible accident. The barn caught fire. They were inside. We tried to get them out, but the fire was too fast. Accident." Rawlings stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, we found chains on the barn doors, padlocks, locked from the outside. Danny said nothing, just kept smoking. We found kerosene residue on the wood. We found your purchase records from Cookville. 60 feet of chain, 2 master lock padlocks bought Monday, 5 gallons of kerosene bought Thursday. Rawlings moved closer. That's not an accident. That's premeditated murder. Bobby made a sound, half sob, half moan, started to run. Got 5 steps before 2 deputies tackled him. He didn't fight, just lay in the dirt, crying. Danny stood slowly, dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his boot. They stole from me. $8,500. I had a right. You had a right to call the police, to file a report, to let the law handle it. Rawlings's voice was cold. You didn't have a right to lock 15 men in a barn and burn them alive. 14, Danny corrected. Marcus attacked me first. That was self-defense. Turn around, hands behind your back. Danny complied. Stood with his back to Rawlings while the handcuffs clicked into place. As they led him to the patrol car, he looked at his land. At the 420 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in 1890. At the fields he'd worked since he was old enough to walk. At everything he'd killed 14 men to protect. Was it worth it? Sheriff Boone asked quietly as he opened the patrol car door. Was it worth it, Danny? Danny Morrison looked at the collapsed barn still smoking in the distance. At the place where 14 men had died screaming his name, cursing him, begging for mercy, he didn't give. Ask me when I'm dead, he said. By 4 p.m., news had spread beyond Clay County. Nashville television stations sent crews. The Tennesseans sent reporters. By Monday morning, it would be national news. Tennessee tobacco farmer burns 14 workers alive in wage dispute. But in Salina on Sunday afternoon, it wasn't news. It was neighbors. It was people you'd known your whole life, suddenly gone. It was children who'd never see their fathers again. It was widows and orphans, and a hole in the community that would never fully heal. At Salina First Baptist Church, Reverend James Butler, who'd driven past the smoking barn that morning without stopping, stood at the pulpit for Sunday evening service. The church was packed, standing room only. People needed to be together, needed to make sense of senseless violence. We ask why, Butler said, his voice breaking. Why this hatred? Why this loss? Why couldn't neighbors settle their differences without bloodshed? He paused, looking at the congregation. At Loretta Washington in the front row, flanked by her 4 children, all of them crying. At Betty Sue Patterson, pregnant and alone. At Melissa Crowder, 19 and widowed before her first anniversary. I have no answers, Butler admitted. I can't explain evil, can't justify it, can't make it make sense. All I can offer is this. We are still here. We are still breathing. And we have a choice. We can let this tragedy destroy us, divide us, consume us. Or we can hold each other up. Can choose love over hate. Can choose community over revenge. But even as he spoke, Butler knew the truth. Clay County was already divided. Some people said Danny Morrison was a monster. Others said quietly, so quietly, that they understood why he'd done it. That they'd been pushed to the edge too. That, in his position, who knows what any of them might have done. At the county jail, Danny Morrison sat in a cell alone. Through the barred window, he could see the October sunset, orange and gold and beautiful. The kind of sunset that made Tennessee look like heaven on earth. He thought about the 14 men, tried to remember their faces from before, from when they were just workers, just people. Tried to feel something, guilt, horror, regret. Felt nothing but a hollow satisfaction that he'd made them pay for disrespecting him. That he'd shown them you couldn't steal from a Morrison and walk away. It would be another 4 months before investigators found the missing tobacco. Found it in a Clarksville warehouse, stored by mistake after a shipping company driver misread his paperwork. Found it covered in dust, forgotten, never stolen at all. Just misfiled. A clerical error. The tobacco Danny Morrison had burned 14 men for had never been stolen. It had been sitting in a warehouse 60 miles away the entire time, waiting to be returned, waiting for someone to notice the mistake. When they told Danny in February 1974, he laughed, not with humor, with something darker. With the terrible understanding that he'd destroyed 14 families, destroyed his own family, spent the rest of his life in prison, all because of a shipping error. Because he'd been so certain, so convinced, so absolutely sure that he was right. "Doesn't matter," he told his lawyer. "They disrespected me. That's what matters." But alone in his cell at night, Danny Morrison asked himself the question he couldn't escape. What if they were telling the truth? What if they really didn't steal the tobacco? What if I murdered 14 innocent men because I was wrong? That question would haunt him for exactly 5 more years. Until April 3rd, 1978, when he'd tie his bedsheet into a rope, loop it around the bars, and step off his bunk for the last time rather than face another day with that question echoing in his head. But the question that haunted Agent Rawlings, the question that haunted Sheriff Boone, the question that split Salina down the middle and would divide the community for decades, was simpler and more terrible. In Clay County, where a man's word was his bond and respect was everything, where the law seemed distant and banks showed no mercy, and neighbors who'd been friends for decades could turn their backs when you needed them most, in that world, was Danny Morrison a monster? Or was he just a desperate man pushed too far? And where exactly was the line between the two? The trial of Daniel Lee Morrison and Robert James Morrison began on March 18, 1974, in the Davidson County Criminal Court in Nashville. The venue had been changed. Finding an impartial jury in Clay County, where everyone knew everyone and opinions had already solidified into opposing camps, was impossible. 14 counts of first-degree murder for Danny. 14 counts of felony murder for Bobby, who hadn't pulled the trigger but had locked the doors, making him an accomplice to every death. The prosecution had everything. The chains purchased in Cookeville, receipts dated October 10th. The kerosene purchased in Salina, October 11th. Phone records showing Danny had called all 15 men on October 12th. Forensic evidence showing the fire had been deliberately set with accelerant. And the padlocks, still locked, brass gleaming, proving beyond any doubt that the barn doors had been secured from the outside while men burned inside. The defense attorneys, 2 overworked public defenders named Robert Caldwell and James Patterson, no relation to victim Jimmy Patterson, attempted to argue that this was a case of extreme emotional disturbance. They painted Danny as a desperate man, driven to the edge by crushing debt, by what he genuinely believed was theft, by a rural code that demanded action when the law wouldn't help. The prosecution destroyed that argument methodically. Extreme emotional disturbance doesn't involve 4 days of planning, doesn't involve purchasing supplies at stores 60 miles away to avoid recognition, doesn't involve calling 15 men with calm, friendly voices, inviting them to their deaths. This wasn't passion. This was premeditation in its purest, coldest form. The jury, 12 people from Nashville who understood rural Tennessee but hadn't lived the specific isolation and economic pressures of Clay County, deliberated for 2 days. 17 hours total. Guilty. All charges, both defendants. Sentencing came on April 2, 1974. Judge William Harrison had presided over murder trials for 23 years. He'd sentenced men to death, sentenced others to life, tried to balance justice with mercy in a system that demanded both and delivered neither consistently. Daniel Lee Morrison, 15 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Robert James Morrison, 12 consecutive life sentences with possibility of parole after 30 years. When Judge Harrison read the sentences, Danny Morrison showed no emotion, no tears, no surprise, just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he lit that barn on fire that this was exactly where he'd end up. The only thing he said, standing to be led away, was directed at Sarah in the gallery. "I protected what was ours." Sarah Morrison didn't respond. She sat frozen, her face pale, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She never visited him in prison. Not once in the 4 years he lived there. Danny Morrison served 4 years and 6 days in the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Petros, Tennessee. He worked in the prison library, kept to himself, never caused trouble. Guards said he was quiet, polite even, the kind of inmate who faded into the background except for the terrible reason he was there. He wrote letters to Sarah that she never answered, wrote letters to his children that came back unopened. In his cell at night, alone with the weight of 14 lives on his conscience, Danny Morrison began to understand what he'd done. Began to see the faces of the men he'd killed not as thieves, but as fathers, husbands, sons. Began to ask himself the question that had no good answer. What if they were telling the truth? On April 3, 1978, at 2:17 a.m., a guard found Daniel Morrison hanging from his cell bars. He'd torn his bedsheet into strips, braided them into a rope, tied it carefully. His farmer's hands still knew how to tie knots that held. His suicide note was 11 words, written on the back of an unopened letter from his daughter Amy. The tobacco was never stolen. Forgive me, God. Forgive me. He was 42 years old. Robert Morrison remained in Brushy Mountain for 31 years. He was granted parole in 2005, at age 70, his health failing, no longer considered a threat to anyone, including himself. He moved to a halfway house in Knoxville, worked part-time at a homeless shelter serving meals, lived quietly until his death from emphysema in 2009. In his only interview, given to a graduate student researching rural violence in 2007, Bobby said, "I was weak. Danny said do it, so I did it. That's all I can say. I was weak, and 14 men died because I couldn't stand up to my brother." Sarah Morrison divorced Danny while he awaited trial. She took back her maiden name, Crowder, and moved to Memphis with her 3 children in 1975. She worked as a secretary for 34 years at a law firm, never remarried, never spoke publicly about what her husband had done. She raised her children alone, trying to give them normal lives, trying to protect them from a legacy of violence and shame. Daniel Morrison Jr., who'd been 16 when his father committed mass murder, changed his name to Daniel Crowder and joined the Army at 18. Served 20 years, retired as a sergeant, lives now in North Carolina with a wife and 2 children who know their grandfather's story but carry it quietly, like a scar covered by clothing. Amy Morrison became Amy Crowder, graduated from nursing school in 1983, worked in pediatric care for 40 years. She never married, never had children. In a rare interview in 2015, she said, "How do you trust your judgment about people when your own father, who you thought was just a hard man but a good man, turned out to be a monster? How do you bring children into a world where that's possible?" Robert Morrison, the youngest, was 10 when it happened. He has no memory of his father except through the lens of what he did. Changed his name, moved to Oregon, works as a carpenter, tries to live a quiet life. He's never given an interview, never spoken publicly. Just carries the weight of a last name he abandoned and a history he can't escape. The 14 families destroyed that October night never recovered fully. Some rebuilt, some didn't. Loretta Washington raised her 4 children alone. Marcus's military benefits helped, but money couldn't replace a father. Anthony, who'd been 9 and dreaming of opening a repair shop with his dad, dropped out of high school at 16. Struggled with anger, with drugs, served 2 years for assault in his 20s, but he found his way eventually. Got clean, got his GED, opened a small auto repair shop in Salina in 1995, Washington's Garage, named for the father who taught him to change oil one October afternoon 42 years ago. He's 61 now, still fixing cars, still thinking about Marcus every single day. Betty Sue Patterson, pregnant when Jimmy died, raised 4 daughters alone. The baby, a girl they named Jamelia after her father, grew up never knowing him except through photographs and stories. Betty Sue never remarried, worked at the Salina post office for 37 years, retired in 2010, lives now with her youngest daughter, 74 years old, still keeping Jimmy's photograph on her nightstand. Melissa Crowder gave birth to a son in April 1974, named him William Ray Crowder, Billy Ray's full name, so his father wouldn't be forgotten. She remarried in 1978 to a man named Thomas Bryant, who raised William as his own. William, 51 now, knows his biological father died in a barn fire when he was still in the womb. Knows it wasn't an accident. Carries that knowledge like a stone in his chest. The Morrison farm was seized by the bank in 1975, sold at auction. Changed hands 3 more times before being purchased by a timber company in 1998. The house where Sarah Morrison cooked Sunday breakfast and Amy asked for vanilla shakes and Danny Morrison planned murder. That house was torn down in 2002. Too much history, too many ghosts. The site where the barn stood, where 14 men died screaming for mercy that never came, is an empty field now. Grass grows, cattle graze. Nothing marks it as special or tragic or significant. Just Tennessee earth covering Tennessee blood until someday, maybe, the memory fades completely. Clay County changed after October 13, 1973. People were more careful with accusations, more hesitant to push neighbors too far. The story became a cautionary tale told in tobacco fields and church basements. Don't corner a desperate man. Don't assume you know everything. Don't let pride and anger make decisions that reason should make. But the change wasn't permanent. Within a generation, new people moved in who didn't remember. The lessons faded. Human nature being what it is, the same patterns emerged. Economic pressure, neighbor conflicts, violence born from desperation. In 2010, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent Victor Rawlings retired after 37 years of service. In a 2018 podcast interview about the Morrison case, he said, "I've investigated hundreds of homicides, gang violence, domestic murders, armed robberies gone wrong. But the Morrison case haunts me differently because there are no easy answers. Was Danny Morrison evil? Or was he just human, fatally, terribly human, pushed beyond his limits by a society that had failed him completely? The law says one thing, the heart says something else. That contradiction is something I've lived with for 45 years. The truth about the Morrison barn massacre has no heroes and no simple villains. It has a desperate farmer who loved his family more than his own life, and 14 workers who made the fatal mistake of trusting an employer who'd decided they were thieves. It has a system that failed at every level. Economic policies that crushed small farmers, banks that showed no mercy to debtors, law enforcement stretched too thin to investigate property crimes, and a rural code of honor so rigid it made violence seem like the only option left when reputation was threatened. Was Danny Morrison a murderer? Yes. He locked 14 innocent men in a barn and burned them alive with planning and premeditation, without trial, without mercy, without proof they'd done anything wrong. Was he a father driven to extremes by circumstances he couldn't control and a belief, however mistaken, that he was protecting what was his? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is, both things are true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do when pushed to the edge? How far would we go to protect what we've built? Does justice exist when systems fail completely? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence, or do extreme circumstances erase that line entirely? Danny Morrison crossed a boundary no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where authorities couldn't help, where banks crushed families without hesitation, where a shipping company's clerical error could destroy lives, and where an honest farmer facing ruin had nowhere to turn except to rage. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished. Just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create their own monsters, and sometimes the line between justice and revenge becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only blood and questions and families destroyed on all sides. 51 years have passed since that October night in Clay County. Rural America hasn't healed. It's evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems fail them. Every year, economic pressure drives ordinary people to desperate measures. Every year, someone somewhere decides that violence is the only answer left. The Morrison farm still exists, though the name has changed. The Morrison name too toxic, too weighted with history. Different owners work different land, raise different cattle, plant different crops. The barn is long gone. The house is gone. Even the foundations were bulldozed and buried. But on October nights when the temperature drops and wind moves through the Cumberland River Valley, older residents of Salina still remember, still tell stories, still wonder what they would have done in Danny Morrison's position if they'd been pushed that far, if they'd believed so completely that they were right. Children play now on ground where 14 men died. Families eat dinner in homes built near where tragedy unfolded. Life continued, as it always does, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. Revenge doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't heal wounds, doesn't restore lost innocence. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new innocence destroyed. Danny Morrison protected his pride but destroyed his soul. He eliminated threats that never existed, but created 14 shattered families, 3 broken children, and a legacy of violence that echoes through decades. In the end, only one question remains. One each of us must answer for ourselves. When the tobacco was found in that Clarksville warehouse in February 1974, never stolen, just misfiled, waiting to be returned, was Danny Morrison's crusade for respect worth 14 lives? Was protecting honor worth becoming the monster he feared others thought he was? If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay when systems fail and ordinary people are pushed beyond their limits, leave your like and subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far we'll go when we're pushed to the edge. Comment below. What would you have done in Danny Morrison's position? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance? Because these stories aren't just history, they're happening right now somewhere. To other people facing the same impossible choices in forgotten places where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One broken fence, one refused payment, one terrible misunderstanding at a time. And sometimes the real tragedy isn't just the violence itself, but how easily it could have been avoided if someone, anyone, had just stopped to ask, what if we're wrong?